Well, thank you all for joining our webinar. We are going to be taking some time to look over our findings from a recent review of state-level high school alternative education budgets and preparing us for the launch of the State Action Collaborative. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Ashley Denton. I'm a managing researcher at Education Northwest. And for those of you who don't know Education Northwest, we are a research, evaluation, and technical assistance nonprofit with an office in Portland, Oregon. But we have clients across the nation. Our vision is equitable and excellent education for all. A little bit of a tongue twister, but a good direction. And as part of that vision, we've been working to better understand the conditions under which students in alternative learning environments can receive the education that really meets their needs. So first, we'd love to hear from you. Taylor is going to go ahead and pop this into the chat, just the prompt, but we'd love to hear your name, the state you live in, and how you're connected to high school alternatives. So are you an alternative school educator, a policy advocate, an interested community member? Go ahead and pop in the chat your connection to high school alternatives. While you're doing that, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. So as you know, I'm Ashley Denton, managing researcher at Education Northwest. Since about 2021, I've been really looking a lot more deeply at high school alternatives and really trying to identify strategies to help support students. And I will pass it along to Ashley Shepard.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Ashley Shepard. I have been with Ed Northwest for about 1.5 years. I'm a principal consultant, and some of the areas that I support are around early indicator and intervention systems work that's happening in ODE or in Oregon, and some work in Washington. And I currently live in Maryland. So that is where I'm joining you from. It's good to meet you all. And I'll pass it to Taylor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Birch. I'm a researcher with Education Northwest. I've been here just a few months. I'm actually located in DC, so not too far from Ashley Shepard. I'm super excited to be here with you today.
Thank you. And we also have a couple of members of our team who aren't able to make it today. Julie Petracuti, who is working hard on identifying some strategies to help Washington students in high school alternatives and in re-engagement programs be successful. And then Natalie Orozco, who's helping to support kind of our media engagement and helping to kind of advertise the work that we're doing and get others to engage more readily. So thank you all for joining. So I wanted to review the objectives of our webinar so far. So first, we're going to give an overview of our project to understand how this review of high school alternative budgets is part of a broader project meant to develop a state action collaborative. Part of this is going to be a review for folks who were part of our initial discussion of our landscape scan, but we're just going to kind of go over it and see how all this fits together. Additionally, we'll define high school alternatives and then dive into our findings of our review of budget policy. This is really meant as an overview of what we see as the most salient topics in the field of budget policy in high school alternatives. So where possible, we're going to provide insights into the core consideration of high school alternatives specifically. And then our webinar will end with some next steps for this work. So why are we here? In 2021, the Annie Casey Foundation approached us wanting to ensure that students in high school alternatives had access to high quality education and career pathways. We know that students have different needs to support high school graduation, especially students who are pregnant and parenting, highly mobile, and need additional income to support their families, or are simply not served by traditional school. To address these needs, communities, school districts, and public agencies need clear and practical guidance on how to improve outcomes for young people whose needs are not being met through the traditional school system. So in other words, we need alternatives to traditional education pathways. Or what we found is that we did not know enough about the complex and ambiguous field of high school alternatives to know how to best support students. To address this lack of understanding, we developed a scan of the national landscape of high school alternatives that we reviewed in our prior webinar and that you can read in our report. And Taylor will drop a link to that report in the chat. Through our scan, we found that there was a lot of headway that could be made related to budget policy. We developed a deeper budget policy review related to high school alternatives that we're going to be looking at today. So after any feedback that we receive from this webinar, which we really hope will be extensive, that you all have a lot of feedback to give us that we can be using in this work. And then we'll make this review into a memo for the field. We'll send the final memo to attendees of this webinar, as well as posting it on our webpage. And then when conducting our work, we really heard time and time again that students, educators, advocates, and policymakers feel really disconnected and unable to make lasting change. To address this clear need from the field, we're cultivating a state action collaborative to bring together state officials, educators, policy advocates, and others to create action plans to address policies related to high school alternatives. We're going to share more about this collaborative at the end of the webinar. So first, we want to spend a little bit of time defining what we're talking about. The field of high school alternatives is rich with complexity and diversity in terms of the students served, the mission, goals, and educational approaches, as well as funding sources and accountability strategies deployed by sponsors and regulating agencies. This abundance of approaches and models has led to confusion among practitioners, policymakers, and funders about what defines an alternative high school, which practices and models work well and for whom, and what policies and funding strategies are needed to serve students effectively and meet the growing demand for high quality pathways through and beyond high school. So as part of the work on the original national scan of high school alternatives, we developed a definition of high school alternatives in close collaboration with our advisory team on that project. We're going to carry this definition throughout our work, including into kind of how we approach the budget and policy review. So at their best, high school alternatives are necessary because traditional systems, including schools, workforce, post-secondary, criminal justice, and others, do not serve all students well or equitably. They provide high-quality educational and career opportunities to empower students who face systemic barriers in traditional schools. Additionally, they support flexible and meaningful asset-based learning opportunities. And then one of the most adamant points made by our advisory team and many interviewees that we've talked to over the course of this project is that traditional schools have a lot to learn from successful alternative schools. So all schools, alternative and traditional alike, should strive to be a place of building momentum. Schools should have a future orientation, providing not only a diploma, but also skills, connection to people and resources, certifications, and workforce preparation that provide future education and economic opportunity for all students. They should be a place where you can nurture healthy relationships with caring adults who affirm students' cultures, identities, backgrounds, and foster a sense of belonging. And then also be a place to empower high quality, well-supported educators and practitioners to provide instructional and comprehensive support. With that definition in mind and really thinking about it from this perspective, now we'll go through the findings of our review of budget policy associated with high school alternatives. Again, where possible, I'm going to be outlining some of our thoughts about the unique implications of budget policy in high school alternatives. But if you have any insights I am not addressing, please feel free to pop in the chat, raise your hand, do whatever you think of and let us know so that we can make sure to make this as meaningful for folks as we kind of engage this work and move this work forward. So to do this, we reviewed recent policy, white papers, and academic resources related to education budgets. We spoke with a few practitioners across the country about their experiences with high school alternative budgets. And then really this work was grounded in and built directly off of the national landscape of high school alternatives we conducted previously. So as we get started with this conversation, I just want to first emphasize that increased funding has been shown to benefit students. So in this study from 2016 that we came across, a 10% increase in per pupil funding each year for all 12 years of public school led to 0.31 more completed years of education, which is obviously critical for students in high school alternatives, about 7% higher wages, and a 3.2% percentage point reduction in the annual instance of adult poverty. While this applies to all schools, I think it's a particularly important consideration for high school alternatives. High school alternatives tend to be extremely resource constrained environments, yet student need is often the most concentrated. Therefore, when we think about this, strategies for increasing access to funding in high school alternatives can really make a demonstrable difference for students and their outcomes as they move into college and career. So first, we're going to review a couple of basics associated with funding models and identify how they relate to high school alternatives. Apologies for those this may be a bit basic for. I don't know if we have any, budget experts on the call, but I find it really helpful to review these before diving into the specifics, as this can be a really muddy, muddy set of policies. So there are a few approaches to funding calculations. Most states use either a student-based funding model or a model that includes student-based funding and some amount of resource-based funding. For student-based funding, the base amount a school or district receives is tied to the number of students who are either attending or enrolled, and then they may receive some weights based on student needs. Resource-based funding approaches just focus on providing schools with sufficient funding to pay for the minimum required resources for schooling. So using the principles of adequacy, equity, responsibility, and transparency, EdBuild determined that a student-based funding formula with weights is gold standard policy. Therefore, we're going to use this to look a little bit more deeply at this structure that is used by most states. Weighted student funding is associated with measurable categories. So students from low-income families, English language learners, students with disabilities, etc. Districts receive additional dollars to help support the needs of students on top of the base amount that they receive for each student. These weights can cover a wide range of total funding. One recent IES study showed that weights covered anywhere from 20 to 89% of total school funding. So yes, it can be really implemented very differently across different districts. They can be established through either a single weight, multiple weights, or a system of weights. In other words, if a state commits to $20 for each of these categories, a student from a low-income family who is also an English learner may receive a flat $20 for being in any category, $40 to represent each of these categories, or something in between. Weighted student funding is particularly important for high school alternatives, as these students students that are being served by high school alternatives often fall into these categories and need additional support to be successful in school. This is often made even more explicit in states that have generated an at-risk, quote unquote, funding rate for student funding. As an example, in DC public schools, if students qualify for at-risk funding if they're experiencing homelessness, they're in the foster care system, students' families qualify for temporary assistance for needy families, their students or families that qualify for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or students are at least 1 year older than the high school grade for which they are enrolled. This is one approach, an example, for ensuring that students that are opted in high school alternatives can receive additional supports. That said, this requires a significant data sharing approach with DC Department of Human Services, DC's Child and Family Services Agency, and the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness. Therefore, this approach, while really supportive of student needs in high school alternatives, can be really resource intensive for the district or the state in which these are situated in. So worth noting that this is one approach, one strategy for doing this. While weighted student funding can provide additional supports for students who are most often representative in high school alternatives, an equitable approach to funding is not guaranteed within this funding model. For example, in some states, the weighted student funding goes to the district, and there's very little transparency on if those funds are distributed to the schools that are actually teaching the students that generated the weights. So if you're thinking specifically about high school alternatives, sometimes this can mean that the district gets a lot of extra funding for students who fall under one of these categories, but that the actual high school alternative itself does not receive those funds. Therefore, it's really critical to consider a state's unique approach to the weighted student funding through the lenses of equity, transparency, and flexibility. For equity, the strongest funding models ensure that resources are distributed equitably based on student need. For transparency, optimal funding system has a clear and easily understood rules for where, how, and why dollars flow. So these rules may be expressed in a formula, which the central office creates and adapts over time with the input of partners and community members. And then for flexibility, by distributing funds rather than staff, good weighted student funding models enable school leaders to define the resources they need to drive student achievement in their particular environments. So these are kind of some things that we think about when we are looking specifically at weighted student funding models. So I'm going to drive through this. Again, if there's any questions or if anyone wants to raise their hand and talk, please feel free to do so. We're going to have some time at the end to discuss and share insights as well. So when thinking about student-based funding considerations, there are also a few approaches to determining who counts, right? Enrollment or the number registered in school, an average of those students who are present across an entire school year. There can be a single count, so number who are present in one single day, or multiple counts, so a fall day, a spring day, something like that, that can kind of count, attendance at multiple times. And so thinking about the considerations for high school alternatives when considering different counting approaches, chronic absenteeism for students in high school alternatives is about 59% compared to 26% in traditional schools. Therefore, things like average daily attendance can really be an inequitable approach for students in alternative schools, given the barriers to school attendance and to being on school on time for attendance to be counted. So with a single count approach, so that, average daily attendance can run into those barriers with attendance. However, the single count approach, many schools actually will wait until the day after the counts to send their students to alternative schools so that they are able to keep the funding within the traditional schools. Therefore, high school alternatives should really look closely at state and district policy to determine the best strategy to ensure that the hard work that they are doing for students is really getting counted in funding policy. To address these issues, some states have come up with alternative strategies for understanding student counts to help address these issues. For example, Texas has an interesting model for students who are, quote unquote, in danger of dropping out or being behind on core subject courses. Under this model, students' instructional hours count toward attendance. So, for example, a student can come from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. or 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., and the school will receive the same amount of funding for these students. So using this example, other attendance models would only count the student who was there for that early morning roll call. This optional flexible school day program model allows the districts to provide flexible hours and days of attendance, which really opens up the opportunity for high school alternatives to meet the unique needs of students. And again, still get that funding rolling in for them to be counted. Oh, this one has. Great. So state policy dictates the upper age limits for required free education with some exemptions for qualifying students for special education. Most states set this at 20 or 21 years old, though some states are lower. Alabama's age limit is 17, and some states have addressed this issue by extending the age limit. So Texas, the age limit is 26. Many students in high school alternatives are significantly behind on credits. So by shifting to provide education for students until they are older, students have a better chance of catching up in credits and graduating. So after students have aged out of free education in their state, there is adult education funding to support the attainment of a diploma or GED. While these systems have been shown to have a lot more flexibility oftentimes, they are funded at a significantly lower rate than K-12 funding. So therefore, really thinking about the age limits that are applied to these things can be one area of change within state funding formulas. Okay, so while this list is generally supported by the literature, please note that enabling conditions for the funding of high school alternatives is really a state and context specific discussion. Excuse me. That said, we found that student-based funding with multiple student support, student weights, in other words, letting that $20 for additional funding count for each of the different categories that students may fall under, is supportive of an equitable approach to providing funding for students in high school alternatives. Additionally, student attendance counts that allow for flexibility. So, for example, counting all the time students spend in high school alternatives toward the funding they receive drives a more equitable allocation of funds for high school alternative settings. Also, providing high school education to students who are at least 22, if not older, can ensure that students have plenty of time and flexibility toward their diploma. And then accountability and transparency in funding is really necessary for monitoring progress and making adjustments. Studies have shown that even the most equitable funding formulas are not always found to be manifesting in equitable funding distributions as intended when there's no accountability and transparency in the funding. Therefore, building these into the actual funding policy is really critical. And then finally, ensuring shared data for decision making is critical. This includes sharing state data around SNAP and other enrollments for funding weights, as well as generally sharing more data about funding and outcomes. So that's what we found for the overall budget approaches. Again, if anyone wants to pop in and share any information or thoughts or feedback, and then we can move on to the next section. Yeah, thanks, Annie. This is really helpful. Great, thank you. This feedback is really great in the chat. Keep it coming. I really appreciate it. So in this next section, we're going to look more deeply at the funding that's needed to support high school alternatives and providing more specific high quality practices. So while we've kind of reviewed the overall funding structures, this is more specific practices that are really shown to be important in high school alternatives. So relevant work-based learning opportunities can really directly support students in high school alternatives. It builds agency, it builds a sense of belonging and engagement, and really builds relevancy into the work that is critical for success within high school alternatives. There are a few funding streams that can be used for high school alternatives to fund these opportunities. So there's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. And under this, most of the funding for youth under age 18 is funneled through youth build programs. And I think, Annie, as you kind of talked about, there's like contractual agreements that are associated with that and that kind of thing. And then, sorry. Additionally, Perkins work-based learning and apprenticeships can be really helpful places to get STEM and career and technical education funding for those apprenticeships. Industry sponsorships can also be a helpful way to provide work-based learning opportunities. However, when we think specifically about this in high school alternative settings, high school alternative staff often struggle with capacity. This can be a real limitation to accessing these larger federal funding streams or having time to invest in relationships with industry partners. So that said, there's a lot of really great examples on a small scale of this work. And we'd love to hear more about other strategies that folks have had for helping make sure this is successful. But there are a few considerations when thinking about funding for work-based learning in alternative environments. So according to one article, alternative education students may typically spend an average of 18 months in their alternative education setting, which may not be long enough to finish like a CTE sequence that may last 2 to 3 years, et cetera. So therefore, identifying strategies for ensuring that the funding is fluid enough that students have the opportunity to finish courses regardless of their enrollment is really critical. It's also critical to pay attention to the quality of work-based learning opportunities, as these can vary widely, and the alignment of those opportunities to industry needs. So without strong alignment, funding can be dedicated towards students to being well prepared for a job that's not even available in their area. So really thinking about that alignment and making sure that funds are really dedicated toward high quality learning experiences. So funding for wraparound services is another high quality instructional practice that can support the needs of students in high school alternatives. So thinking really about, as an example, state funding or funding for student and mental health. So you can think about the state sources that are engaged in this. There's state-specific appropriations, school funding models, earmarked tax revenue. There's multiple different ways that states can really approach this funding. And then also there's significant federal sources. So through the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, there are several different grant and kind of funding distribution strategies to make sure that students can get access to mental health services. So for example, activities to support safe and healthy students is funded through ESSA dollars. That's really generated through the local education agencies. And that's one strategy for getting access to this. But again, while those opportunities can really be supportive of the work of high school alternatives, many educators that we spoke with talked about needing to get creative based on lack of capacity or really needing access to those dollars through their district or through their state, et cetera. So many get creative through community partnerships and industry sponsorships to provide the wraparound services to their students. So this could be partnering with a local counselor who's willing to come on site and bill Medicaid, or getting industry sponsorship to house a food bank, shower, washer, dryer, or other services on campus. Those kinds of things that can really kind of provide those wraparound services in more one-off environments. But again, really thinking about this more broadly, we'd be really interested in ways other folks are getting access to funding to help them support students with wraparound services. Okay, this is the last little bit, and then we can break out in discussion, and I'd love to hear more from you all. So the last is really thinking about providing opportunities for student identified goals that grow with student interests and abilities and set students up for secondary and post-secondary success. So we have two really examples of the way that this is supported through two different budget models. So one is Mississippi's Career Coaches model, and the other is with Excel Centers. So from a statewide perspective, Mississippi has started providing funds from the state legislature to Accelerate Mississippi to provide career coaches to school districts across Mississippi, supporting career training and workforce development. So far, they've helped folks become first-generation college students. They've worked with employers to provide jobs and fields of interest, and establish different paths to certification programs like coding, barbering, welding, truck driving, and other skilled professions. So this is one strategy, is really going straight to the legislature and making the argument, making the case for supporting career coaches to help students get access to these things, to help move them through this work more directly. The other is Excel Centers as an example. So they're a comprehensive model of support for tuition-free high school, provides opportunities for diploma seeking, while also a range of supportive services and earning industry recognized certifications. So students are supported by Goodwill mission coaches that support college entry, job opportunities, and connection to local resources and more. And this work really has a different funding model in the states that it's in. But in 2022, it expanded into Arizona through use of the American Rescue Plan funding, as well as a mix of other state and federal funding and donations. So these adult supports for student-led educational goals can be a real game changer for students in high school alternatives. And these are kind of two examples of ways of pathways for funding that might be considered for these opportunities. So I will pass it on to Ashley to lead the discussion. I'll note that we had talked about doing breakout groups in our description of this opportunity, but we've got a pretty small group, so we're just gonna kind of roll with the big group engagement. So take it away, Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley number one, and I'll be Ashley number two. So, as Ashley had mentioned, we wanted to create kind of space to have dialogue and conversation about what some of the bright spots are in your state. And I appreciate and just want to call out appreciation for those of you who have been sharing things in the chat. But when we think about, budgets and policies around this work, are there any bright spots in your states, things that are working well, that are helping to support your students in supporting alternative high schools? And if there are, you can continue to drop in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I can actually unmute you so that you can share your voice in this space. And then we can also talk about challenges, but wanted to start off on a positive note. Awesome. Go ahead, Andy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hey, Rhett. So I think in Oregon, out of necessity, the folks who have been really successful in funding their programs have just been, they get really creative. They look for every single grant opportunity. They're, braiding funds using public, private, federal, state, everything that they can, which is great, except that, like I said, it's out of necessity. I think that our community-based organizations like Youth Build, they also out of necessity, because when they're contracting with our school districts, they receive such a small amount from the district, they have to have other sources of funding. And I'm sorry, I'm sort of processing this as I'm talking. I think that really it just takes innovation, and it shouldn't have to. I mean, if we're talking about equitable access to, a high quality education, that should be accessible to everyone. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Annie. I appreciate that. And I am kind of wondering, when you talk about braiding funding, are there any specific formulas or specific sources of funding that are consistent that are braided so that you know what I mean? Because sometimes there's funding that kind of comes and goes, ebbs and flows. And then if you can't really depend on it, then it's hard to make these programs sustainable. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering if there are specific funds that folks are going to consistently, or if you have a specific formula or something that you use.
I can't think of anything that isn't legislatively dependent.
Okay.
And so those obviously are going to, be good for the biennium and might be upped, might be re-upped, but they might not. So I don't, there's nothing that is absolutely consistent all the time that I can think of.
Fair enough. Thank you. That is part of the struggle. Nina. Go ahead, Nina. You should be able to share.
Hi there, my name's Nina. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and work with the City of San Antonio's Department of Human Services. One of our city programs is an Opportunity Youth Reengagement program. And so I wanted to bring up the challenge in that our reengagement center is not necessarily an alternative education, but provider, but we are a pathway to the provider. And most, if not most of our participants have used us as a conduit to finding that alternative education program. So my question here is if Education Northwest has found in their research any kind of grants that city actually can tap into, or foundations that would fund either scaling out or continuing this work. I will say that something that's happened recently is we had a 3-year partnership with one of our local school districts, who's actually the 4th biggest in Texas. And our 3-year partnership is about to end. They had used their ARPA funding to fund one of our expansion sites. Our 3-year is coming to an end in March, and so we've recently had some fiscal budgeting cutbacks, or not necessarily cutbacks, but our fire department has negotiated well, and they're going to be well funded in this next coming fiscal year, and therefore the funding for our programming has been put to a halt. So I just wondered if there was anyone within the group or within Education Northwest that had some kind of insight on what's happening with legislation in terms of funding opportunity youth in general, because I do know that we had representatives approach legislation and advocate for opportunity youth, and I have not heard of an outcome for that specifically in Texas. But again, putting it to the group to see if anyone has insight or experience in legislation supporting opportunity youth specifically. And I guess I should back up just one step. And opportunity youth are those out of high school, disengaged from either the community or from programming, who mostly don't have connection with education or with career. Again, a lot of our participants do not have a high school credential. And so that is primarily where our focus is. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to pass it along to Julie, who is doing a ton of work right now in Opportunity Youth and thinking through this a little bit more.
I would kick this off with a couple of resources, and apologies if I missed the first part of your question. I think the National League of Cities has a really great network around youth re-engagement, which is a really great place to start. And the Aspen Institute has the Opportunity Youth Forum. So I don't know if there's anybody on the call who is active in either of those networks who would want to share some insights from your work in those spaces. I would defer to you all.
I don't know if you can still hear me. Can you still hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I didn't know if I was muted or unmuted. But we're actually a part of the National League of Cities, and they use our re-engagement as a model for others that are a part of the National League of Cities. And also Aspen. We are actually a member of the Aspen Institute for Community Solutions as well. But again, the question was more so like if anyone had any insight specifically about legislation wanting to support opportunity youth, or if it has happened in other states.
Right, I see you have your hand raised. Would love to hear what you want to share.
And if you could mute me, that would be great, because I'm not seeing how to mute myself.
Sure. So I think Washington, I feel like we've got a number of different funding approaches to schools to allow different types of flexibility. We recognize schools because they're serving the students. So we assume that the students are trying to attend full time and fund based on that assumption, only sort of knocking funding off when students are absent for a significant extended period of time. We have some flexible funding called alternative learning experiences as well that allows schools to claim funding and serve the student where the student might not be on campus in a sort of regular way either. So we have a lot of good things, I think, here in Washington. I think just some of the struggles that I've seen is, oh yeah, we also have open doors, so a re-engagement funding model serving those students that are really high at risk, probably are not making regular progress, not able to participate very often. So those factors, a different approach to how we fund schools that are serving those students are all in place here. We have a lot of options here. Some of our challenges is just clarifying when do you use these different options? What's the purpose? What are you trying to do locally? That how can we fund it from the state level? But some of the challenges we have, like just recognizing, when these alternative schools are set up, they're often, smaller schools. So a lot of school districts have trouble with the scale. Like, how do we operate 2 programs when we have funding to operate basically 1 program of instruction? And yeah, so I think those are some of the concerns that we have. How do we better support these littler schools? Our weights, as I mentioned earlier, they recognize low income, they recognize students with disabilities, they recognize bilingual learners. Those things they don't recognize. We don't weight based on students that have struggled in previously, or students that were late to engage in school, or these other measures. And that's how lots of these alternative schools are built, is around serving students that this regular setting wasn't working for them. So they're dealing with sort of the recovery as well as providing education. The way we do weight schools predominantly throughout the state, besides those markers, is we call it regionalization. So that's where it's basically giving them more funding because there's a higher cost of living, and we want to make sure that the teachers they're able to hire teachers that live in the area. But again, sort of that creates other inequities that we're basically giving higher income areas more money for schools, and lower income areas less money for schools. And those lower income areas often have fewer services and stuff available to students as well. So like locally, community-based orgs, those kinds of things. So really sort of those are where we have some challenges in how do we support schools to be able to provide, school districts to be able to provide these alternative options and make sure they're adequately funded. And I talked a lot there. So thanks.
Thanks for sharing that, Rhett. And Nina, I see your hand up. I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Yeah, I think I just had a follow-up. I don't think it's a question, but more of, I think in the last webinar for you all, you mentioned, I think, a technical assistance grant potentially for alternative education programs. But I just wondered if there was anything for not a direct service provider, but for those that connect to the direct service provider for alternative education. And maybe we don't have the answer now, but I just wanted to see if, like, when we're talking about alternative education, is it the direct service program or provider the one that's the primary focus or the only focus? I didn't know if I could get some clarification on that.
Yeah, sure. I can provide a little bit of description. We're bumping into the next section, but we'll here we can actually, let's just do is we'll hop over there and do this. So for those who were not on a prior call about this, and then we'll hop back to continue our discussion. I don't want folks to think that we're cutting the discussion short. But as part of our work at Education Northwest, we are supporting a state action collaborative. So we are hoping to draw together 8 states with about 3 to 5 representatives from each state. And that, Nina, to your point, can include anyone engaged in this work. We're really thinking broadly. We would like to make sure that includes someone from the state just to help make sure that there is some eye toward implementation strategies, but really thinking about this. And the goal of the State Action Collaborative would really be to draw together these teams and help each team formulate their own action plan associated with policy or budget policy associated with high school alternatives. So, Nina, as you're, thinking, and Annie, as you're talking, and Brett, there's these areas that need to be addressed to help make sure that students who are in high school alternatives are getting access to full funding to help support their work. And so that's a great way to think about an action plan associated with those funding strategies being part of this work. It'll be technical assistance from both the Education Northwest team, and we're also going to reach out nationally and help folks come in who have had success in these programs, who may, have some successful strategies of engaging their cities in doing this work, who may have some more success in re-engagement networks that want to bring some of that success into the high school alternative space. More specifically, et cetera. So we can really help support you in finding who's the best folks to be talking to and engaging with, et cetera. And then also this call is a great representation of what we want to see in that work, which is for you all to help us understand what's going on and help generate those insights and information about how different states are approaching this work. And so we're going to give a lot of opportunities for folks to share information and resources and engage in networking and really provide information and insights for other states to be thinking about in their work. Right now we're thinking about November to April. We may push this back a little bit depending on what we kind of need to do to make sure we can all recover from the election. We might go back into December, but then we're really thinking about one-on-one and group technical assistance. So yes, I just wanted to, so Nina, to your point, just thinking about this, we want to engage folks, not just that are implementation. We really want to be engaging folks more broadly from different state agencies and, policy networks and lobbyists. We want to get everybody in a room together and start talking. And so any way that we can help support you in that team formation, if you're interested in kind of seeing some of this work happen in Texas, that'd be an opportunity. Yes, there is a link to the one pager that we'll go ahead and drop in the chat.
Alrighty, I see a couple of folks and I want to apologize because I'm not quite sure who raised their hand first. But I'm going to go ahead and let Myron share and then Sherry.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm quite curious about what you just talked about with the state collaborative, and how does that work? Do we need to have the people identified already, or how does that process work for us to get engaged and involved?
Yes, you don't have to have them identified now. We're going to be releasing a request for applications toward the end of this month. And during that time, you'll have a much more clear guidance on what that state action collaborative will look like. And then during that time, we'll kick off a period where we can support you through technical assistance to engage folks that you need to. So it can either be that you have a couple of folks in mind and you want us to sit down and have that conversation collectively, or if you want just a little bit of assistance in thinking through exactly which policies would be the best for this action plan, and then who within your state would be best to draw in for that. All of those things. So we can help you with, provide some technical assistance and team formation based on what your needs are within each individual state and kind of help you be thinking through that. So just I'll put my email in the chat, and then it's also on the website. There's an area to reach out.
Myron, I hope that answers your question. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And Sherry, you can go ahead and share.
Yeah, I'm from Wisconsin. I work at the Department of Public Instruction, and I am an alternative education consultant. And I oversee alternative education. And then I also work with GED and high school equivalency diploma as the administrator for our state. So kind of, working both sides with adults and school age students. And we used to have alternative education grants that would go out to the districts. They would apply for the grants and share their district-wide at-risk plans, and somewhere along the way, those were dissolved. I came on in 2019, and they had just kind of ended that. And as a result, it's kind of like what Annie said, that there's some schools that have done a great job with innovative partnerships or applying for grants. But it's hit or miss, and many times it's the districts that because of how schools are funded, that are in the most need, that do not find their way to some of those pots of money. And so I'm definitely interested in being a part of that state action collaborative, because I think that there's this recognition that we need to do something. We have a lot of disengaged students, but we just have over time created policies that just kind of overlooked, and there's not that transparency of where the money goes, and they've overlooked this area while funding many other things. So one thing that happened, we used to track, do a better job with the data and tracking the number of students who were identified at risk of not graduating. And then it was decided, with really not any discussion with all the stakeholders, that we were going to stop identifying those students, because there was this concern that school districts were hiding them to improve their numbers. And so anyways, it's just been kind of frustrating. And so I'm excited that there's a group of people that is interested in this work, and I'm looking forward to, being a part of some brainstorming and develop some initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sharon. We're excited that you're excited. More, the more the merrier, right? And this work, we can't do it in a vacuum, and it can't just be the work of one organization alone. We have to collectively make an effort to work together to brainstorm some solutions and come together. So thank you for sharing that. Scott, I'll go ahead and invite you to come off mute.
Yeah, I wanted to react to a previous strand around time that was in one of the slides, and a potential bright spot and challenge for competency-based, portfolio-based demonstrations of learning for diplomas in some alternative ed settings. And I'll speak to the Youth Build Network, which I'm most familiar, and there's a lot of research excuse me, in our network, that programs that run for longer amounts of time do better in terms of most outcomes, in terms of academics included. So that aligns with your previous slide. But trying to disassociate that with seat-based requirements for graduation and credits. So we offer a competency-based diploma. We're working with a lot of programs who are trying to become schools who want to do the same. But their ability to either get contracts for alternative schools with districts or charter schools that allow for that is obviously politically difficult in lots of contexts. So competency-based, portfolio-based demonstrations of learning instead of, in Pennsylvania, Keystones, Regents in New York, but the test to earn a diploma for high school graduating seniors. So potential bright spot with lots of policy hurdles that we're trying to clear in lots of instances.
Well, I just want to recognize and name that we have just a couple minutes left. Ashley, I don't know if you want to share some next steps, any more information about the next couple webinars.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for this. And I love the discussion. It's, again, making me very excited about things to come, because I love the nuance that you all, from your experience, are able to bring to this conversation, and really thinking about, Scott, as you were kind of saying that, thinking about the way that this relates to policy and how these best practices that we know that really work for students really need to be supported and looked at from a holistic approach, and thinking about this and kind of the implementation side of things, really understanding how things get implemented and how things get rolled out. So I'm very excited, and Sherry, I'm just very excited about the opportunity to kind of think about drawing everybody into conversation and engaging together. And so again, I just want to plug this opportunity, State Action Collaborative. I think it's going to be a really interesting opportunity to continue these discussions and really go in a lot more in depth with folks who are interested in doing some of the same work in some of the same areas, really thinking through those accountability models and how that might be both a barrier and a facilitator of these discussions, et cetera. These are the questions and the types of conversations we really want to push forward through the work of the State Action Collaborative. So very exciting work. Please continue to be thinking about how, people from your state or the states that you work with more broadly who might be interested in forming a team. Please go ahead and we'll get to this, connect with us, reach out and engage us so that we are able to help you, help support you in that team formation, et cetera. We have 2 upcoming webinars. They're the same webinar done twice, but just wanted to make sure we get small groups for each one. These are opportunities to kind of come in and let us know exactly what you want to see in the State Action Collaborative. So if you want very specific, you have very specific ideas for how you want this to go, or different things that you want to know about, or you have questions about, or that you want to engage us more readily, these 2 upcoming webinars in about a little less than 2 weeks, you'll get an email about them. These are great opportunities to bring your questions, bring your ideas, bring all of this excitement so that we can start thinking about how to build this to be able to best serve each of these states that are represented. We can provide technical assistance on building a state team. And then we're also just here for any thoughts, questions, or comments that you have. Please feel free to reach out and engage us more directly. Again, my email address is here. This is available, and the copy of this recording will be available, will be sent to you all soon, as well as the memo when it's completed. And I just want to thank you all so much for your participation. This has been great.